Hello and welcome back to this Down Palladiostic Crusade. This video will be a review of the classic Italian Western Death Rides a Horse from 1967 and its Blu-ray release by Kino Lorber here in Region A. This is really one of the iconic Italian Westerns, and due to its really flood of public domain releases here in the US and the fact that it was picked up by UA originally and has strong Leone connections, it is one that is more commonly seen and will be one of the sort of gateway Italian Westerns that you come to after seeing the Dollars trilogy and the other Sergio Leone Westerns. This was the first Italian Western that I saw after getting into Leone and falling madly in love with his films and his Westerns, and so this was sort of my first broadening of the horizons of what the Italian Western was. And it's a great way to do so because it shares a great score by Ennio Morricone. It was written by the great Luciano Vincenzoni, who wrote on both For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, then had a falling out with Leone and wound up working on this film, which has strong, to say that it has strong Leone vibes is an understatement, because it has so many connections and parallels to both For a Few Dollars More and GBU, and even Fistful of Dollars, really, that it very much wears its inspirations on its sleeve, right down to some of the mannerisms of the characters and some of the situations feeling reminiscent of the Leone films. And of course, the fact that they shared the same screenwriter and composer, and this was also shot in Techniscope and had many of the same familiar faces, and stars Lee Van Cleef and many other famous faces from the Leone films, means that this definitely has some of the same shared DNA, and it's pretty much baked in. I don't think it's a stretch to say the Italian Western was sort of in the shadow of the Leone films, and you do get that feeling when seeing this. Now, as a film, this was directed by Giulio Petroni, who did a number of really great and iconic Italian Westerns, but again, I think this is very easily digestible for those of us in the U.S. just coming to Italian Westerns for the first time, and especially because there is such a strong physical direct connection to the Leone films across the board. Now, the plot deals with, it is very straightforward, but being an Italian Western is handled in a very dark and gritty way, with some of the same cynical humor coming from Vincenzoni that he injected into two films of the Dollars trilogy. So we have the John Philip Law character as a young boy in the film's very striking and dark, moody opening, essentially be the only survivor of a brutal attack and murder of his family at their ranch house. And it takes place during a very dark and stormy night when this group of bandits breaks in all masked, and the little boy has it forever burned into his brain, seeing his entire family brutally tortured, raped, and massacred before the house is set afire and burned to the ground. And the boy just barely survives. And then we, of course, cut to, 15 years later, when he has simply designed his entire life around the notion of vengeance, but doesn't know who the actual perpetrators were outside of individual identifying characteristics. The whole opening is very striking. It does have very much the feeling of a horror film, and being an Italian Western is a very dark and brutal opening, very much what you couldn't get away with in a earlier, say, 1950s Western for sure, but a sign of the darker influence that the Italian Western had already had on American Westerns of the 60s. But it goes from there to become a very much a mirrored version of the sort of older, wiser figure played by Lee Van Cleef here in this film, and the younger, hipper, more laconic, quiet-spoken gunslinger character here played by John Philip Law. So there is a direct mirroring of the relationship in For a Few Dollars More between the Van Cleef Colonel Mortimer character and the Eastwood iconic Man with No Name. That's one of the many parallels, and of course, since they share the same screenwriter, of course there's going to be parallels. But if you love that relationship in For a Few Dollars More, with Lee Van Cleef stealing all the scenes with those little glimpses at his more reckless partner, You get them in spades in this film, and Lee Van Cleef is absolutely amazing. And if you're a Van Cleef fan or you love his work in For a Few Dollars More, this film is a must-watch simply for that. The two characters basically come together and are going to be dealing with the same gang members. Van Cleef's character has been in prison for an extended period of time and is now out and seeking basically compensation and revenge among his former gang partners for the time he spent in prison. And then it becomes a sort of back and forth, taking the piss out of each other relationship between the two primary characters as they essentially try and take down this gang all these years later for different reasons. So again, very much that sort of For a Few Dollars More back and forth, humorous and darkly cynical relationship between the two, and in an Italian Western that again is shot in Techniscope with a amazing Ennio Morricone score, and with a lot of the same familiar faces you will recognize from countless other Italian Westerns and the Leone films as well. So you see, of course, Mario Brega pop up here, and the great Luigi Pistilli plays the head villain, so he pops up as he was in both For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So if you're a fan of the Leone films, you'll also recognize many, many, many different faces. And of course, the film is chock full of other Western references, as most Italian Westerns were, because they were great fans of the form. And it builds to a really fantastic climax that is very much inspired by the ending of The Magnificent Seven, where there's essentially a standoff in a small village using the assistance of the villagers themselves to have a final standoff against the gang of bandits. And again, the entire film has that very dark, gritty tone, since it is an Italian Western, and it definitely has that sort of shared Leone DNA. This was distributed by United Artists here in the U.S. in 1967, so it does have some American money in it, which is why this is from an MGM master. And it is very easily available, but unfortunately it was stuck in terrible quality copies, and somehow the public domain copies got their hands on it, so you would see just terrible pan and scan copies. Again, this was the first non-Leone Italian Western I saw, and because it was so readily available and it had Lee Van Cleef in it, I was like, oh wow, this will be great. And every version was just horrible. So the first version I saw, unfortunately, was pan and scanned, but it still didn't detract from the actual film experience, because the film is wonderful fun. It definitely is one of the better Italian Westerns, and it is one that people are going to be more familiar with. Now, in terms of the releases, I would say avoid all of the terrible releases that are out there or what pops up on television broadcasts, because they are just horrible. This is coming from MGM's master, so it has the MGM logo. This is the complete version of the film, actually in widescreen, and it is definitely the best looking I have ever seen the film in any presentation. And it has, the original mono soundtrack, and this is easily the best experience I've ever had watching this film. It has this lovely vintage poster artwork. It's a really nice Kino release, and I do think this is really the only version of the film you should be associating with, because they're all horrible in terms of all the crappy public domain releases that are chopped up, missing pieces, have off-sync audio or pan and scanned, and just blown out, just awful messes. So MGM, I think they did a DVD at some point of this master that is very rare and limited, or at least I think they did. I swear I remember there was some MGM DVD that happened at some point, so this would be from that same MGM master source. Interestingly, this is one of the rare Italian Western releases that also has its original Italian audio. So this release gives you the option to view the film with either its English mono and lossless or the Italian mono and lossless, which is a great treasure, because Italian films were shot silent and everything was post-synchronized and completely created in the studio in terms of audio. So, of course, the Italian release was the primary mix and done first, and is, of course, technically the most important one, except for the English mix has the actual American actors doing their own dialogue. So that's the great draw of the English mono mix. But it is rare to have the Italian included on any other releases outside of Italy, especially here in the US. And it's not on the case. It doesn't tell you it has the Italian audio, so it's a surprise when you put the disc in. And it is in rather nice quality, just like the English track, for for what it is. And again, it's amazing to have that as an option. Now, to talk about the quality of the presentation, again, this is MGM's master, obviously done a number of years ago, I would guess sometime in the mid-2000s. It is in widescreen. It is the complete version of the film, but that isn't to say that it is a perfect presentation, because unfortunately there is some age-related wear, there is occasional frame wobble, there is one or two spots I noticed where there are some frames missing. It's very minor, but there's one or two spots where there's a little tiny jump, and then there are some visible gate errors and things like that. All this is to be expected for something that hasn't gotten a full, camera negative restoration in 4K or something, and this is a master from probably sometime in the early to mid 2000s. So again, it's unfortunate, but compared to how this film has been presented for all these years on video, this is to say it's a lightning quality jump forward is an understatement. So getting the film in widescreen alone and then in HD as well in a presentation that is actually watchable and enjoyable is just like head explode quality. So you will have to live with those age-related issues. They are not detractive from the experience, and if you know anything about how this film was presented before, you'll be like me and you'll be like, oh, that's nothing. It's amazing to see this completed in widescreen and then have the option to actually view the film in its Italian version with the Italian audio is just the icing on the cake. So even though it's not a perfect transfer, I can by far and away recommend this as the only video release of this film to really be interested in, because all the previous ones are just absolute junk for the most part, because they're usually public domain junk. But anyway, you will have to live with those issues, but again, they are relatively minor in comparison. It does, again, have the English mono and the Italian mono. The English mono does sound pretty good, but it is rather strident in places. It does have some baked-in distortion, particularly in the higher end, as you would expect from a track of this time period. I have not looked at all of the foreign editions, and if they did do a brand new 4K restoration of this film, it is possible, well, definitely the picture would be improved, you could get rid of some of those master issues, but it is possible to do a brand new audio restoration and really present the film's audio as best as possible. But all that aside, I was rather pleased that the English mono sounded as good as it did, which is far better than I've ever heard it sound before, particularly for the Morricone score. But again, it does have age-related issues because this is an older master coming from particular sources, and it's not a brand new 4K restoration. The Italian audio also sounds really excellent, and in some ways, the Italian version sounds better than the English mono, but then the English mono sounds better in places than the Italian, and they're also slightly different in their mix because they were also, the English dub was being placed on top of the Italian version, and of course, it's going to have some variations and differences and mix levels and sound effect levels and the music and such. So it's another important reason why the Italian version should be included. This also does give you some extras. It gives you an Alex Cox commentary, which is a nice listen, but if you've heard one of his tracks before, like for Vera Cruz, even though he is giving good, solid information, he obviously adores Italian Westerns and has actually shot Westerns on some of the similar locations and is a diehard fan of these. He is very soft-spoken, and there are frequent passages of silence where you're just listening to the film, so it's very much sort of the experience you would imagine of if you were just sitting on the couch in his house or something and he was just talking about the film while it played. So you will have to live with that, but it is worth listening to, even though it does have passages where you're just listening to the film audio. It also includes the original trailer, which is in pretty decent shape. It's still standard def, but at least it's watchable, unlike a lot of Italian Western trailers and the condition they survive in. And it is the U.S. United Artists version with some really fun, classic advertising tagline campaigns and such, with a great trailer voiceover. So it's a fun trailer, even though it is in standard def. I do think this is easily the best release of the film there is. I do highly recommend it. It is MGM's old master, but until somebody does a 4K restoration of this, I definitely think this is the release to own, and it was a joy coming back to this film and seeing it at least in widescreen in this kind of quality and being able to sample the Italian mix and to get a nice new commentary on top is just it is one of the essential Kino discs, and again, I don't think there is any other release that is anywhere near as good as the Kino release. So again, even though this it is definitely in the shadow of the classic Leone westerns, I think it is a great starting point for people who are looking to get more into other Italian westerns. It's obviously not one of the top tier most famous non-Leone westerns, like the most famous films of Sergio Corbucci, like of course The Great Silence, and then you also have the Django films, and then there's the Sartana films, and then the Sabata films, also starring Lee Van Cleef. There's so many films, and then the films that are more in the political vein, like Bullet for the General. There are just so many films you can get into, but it's been very difficult with their video history in the U.S. But if you were looking for a film that definitely has the feeling of the Leone westerns, but is obviously others, and is sort of a way to transition into the other Italian westerns. If you're looking for the great film to start with, I don't think you can do any better than Death Rides a Horse, and I adore the title. It has grittiness, it has darkness, it has the cynical humor, it has Vincenzoni's fingerprints all over it, and it definitely wears its Leone inspirations on its sleeve while having a great identity of its own. It's also got a great additional tidbit for Bond fans because the great actor Anthony Dawson appears as one of the gang members. So that was a great surprise the first time I saw this film. He did do a number of Italian films in the 1960s, probably most infamously the hysterically awesome, can't believe they made it, Operation Kid Brother. It's just unfortunate here in this film, it doesn't seem like he dubbed himself. It seems very obvious he was dubbed by somebody else. But it is great seeing him in this because has such a great presence on screen, and it's wonderful seeing him get to interplay with Lee Van Cleef and John Philip Law and the other famous faces from the Leone films. So again, this is the Kino Lorber Blu-ray of Death Rides a Horse. I think it's the best release of the film to date, and until somebody does a brand new restoration, I think this is easily the best release it's ever had and the only way you should watch this classic Italian Western.